author, book reviewer, and woman of many, many skills and traits and backgrounds. So Fran, we'll turn it over to you now.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Chris, for the warm introduction. Good evening, everyone. My name is Fan Wu, and I'm the moderator of tonight's panel. I'm an author and co-founder of Society Heart's Delight. Welcome to United Against Hate panel discussion. And thanks to the City of San Jose, particularly the Office of Racial Equity and the Silicon Valley-based nonprofit organization, the Society of Heart's Delight, for making this event possible. So there was a lot of preparation, and I'm so glad finally it's happening. And we are so delighted today to have 5 very impressive guests joining us. We have Vincent Penn here. He is a co-director of Chinese for Affirmative Action and founding partner of Stop AAPI Hate. Vincent, welcome. And we have Zhen Chen. She's a co-founder of Tech for AAPI Alliance and co-founder and president of Product Pub. Welcome, Chen. We are also joined tonight by Hui Chen, Sarah Fernando, and Herbie Carl Batia. Hui is a board member at Vietnamese American Roundtable and a partner at Justice at Work Law Group. Sarah is a senior management analyst at Santa Clara County Office of LGBTQ Affairs. Herbie is CEO of Ikonka Bridges and a community organizer with Sikh Gurdwaras of San Jose and Silicon Valley. Hui, Sarah, and Herbie, thank you very much for coming. We're very happy to have you here. I mean, I talked to all the speakers this couple of days, and I was very impressed by what they have done. I'm just really delighted they are here to share with us their insight. So tonight, we're really looking forward to a very frank and dynamic conversation about how we can all work together to fight hate and discrimination. Considering the surge in anti-Asian American racism since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, we'll focus our today's discussion on the fight against AAPI hate. Chris already mentioned, right? The hate, there was a lot of hate, a lot of discrimination these days. So how do we work together as communities to really fight against such hate and discrimination? And this spirit, the spirit of this event is going to be like that of a backyard discussion, let's say that. So it's not a town hall meeting, it's not a newsroom interview. So we want everybody to be relaxed and grab, your favorite tea or coffee. So, and let's just have a really nice conversation. Now let's hear insight from our speakers. I mean, we only have an hour and a half, and I really want to hear as much as possible from our speakers. And we'll have some time, about 15 minutes for our audience at the end of the meeting. So if you have any questions, do share them, okay? So we want to hear your voice too. So Sarah, Vincent, Chen, Herbie, and Hui, you're all really experienced and accomplished community leaders. I really admire what you have done. At the same time, you come from, very diverse background. So I wonder, how has your upbringing, particularly your identity as Asian American, influenced your work in social and racial justice? I know you all have very interesting stories to share, but Hui, let's start with you. I talked to you yesterday on the phone. I thought your stories are really interesting.
Sure, and thank you for inviting me to be here. It's always a pleasure to speak along with such great folks. I love the work of the Office of Racial Equity, and I'm very happy to be here. Just a bit about me then, I am the child of refugees. I was born here in the States, but both of my parents came over as refugees from the Vietnam War. Growing up in the San Pablo, Richmond area, there weren't as many Vietnamese folks, so I kind of developed a strong identity around being Asian American in that sense. But when I moved to San Jose and saw a lot more Vietnamese people, I really started to explore my own identity too as a Vietnamese American. So in that sense, it actually has helped frame and shape my view of how we organize in our communities. The way, one of the complications that I think we have to address when we talk about the AAPI identity is simply that we are a really, really large group. If we're looking at landmass, Asia covers 1/3 of the planet. And that means there are a variety of experiences of the Asian American population. And that has to be taken into account when we look at how best to organize within our community, how to build relationships between our communities, and how to be strong advocates for our shared experiences as Asian Americans, but also for our respective experiences within our cultural groups, right? The experiences of Vietnamese Americans is not necessarily going to be the same as South Asians. The experiences of Filipinos may not necessarily be the same as Korean Americans, Japanese Americans. And I think that's something that we have to honor, acknowledge, and work with as well.
Yeah, thank you. How about other speakers? Do you have anything you wanted to share with our audience?
Well, I don't mind jumping in. My parents are also immigrants, and my brothers and I were born here in the United States. And I think from as long as I can remember, I always had an understanding of what it meant to be around people who were both similar and different. Because I think there were many spaces, whether having a large family, where I was able to identify people with, a common culture, similar foods, shared language, as well as people from very different backgrounds. And I think like some of how I've come to understand identity is that it's really a pathway. It's a pathway that helps us understand at some level what it means to be human. And I think in particular, now the way I think about my Asian American identity is very much as an ethical framework. That what matters most is not what we look like, but what we stand for. And I think if you look at the long history of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in this country, both struggling with discrimination and overcoming it, it points us towards a set of values that hopefully inspire us to want to achieve more equity, not just for our communities, but for all communities, and to understand that we all have such unique contributions, and that diversity can really be the strength of our country and our communities.
If I may add also, I think it's really nice to hear Hui and Vincent. They brought up some amazing points actually that I hadn't thought of when it comes to your thought process and the ideology. And I say that, you really hit home there, because there are so many differences, but there's also this many similarities that you look across Asian communities, the respect for elders, making sure your value for school, value for financial stability. I mean, there are just so many things, right? I mean, I was just joking around with, a fan before, usually we take our shoes off before you come in the house. I mean, that's just pretty common across the board. But like Kui mentioned, also there's a huge amount of diversity as well. So Asians within themselves also need to learn about each other. I mean, actually, the Sikh community or South Asian community often gets left out when it comes to understanding AAPI issues, because it's just, we forget that it's not a racial question only, even though we call it race issues, it's actually a regional issue as well, right? And whether you're Sikh, whether you're Hindu, whether you're Muslim, whether you're Christian, whether you're Buddhist, whether you're, Jain, there's just so many traditions also. So there's one angle, which is our dimension, which is our cultural heritage. And I mean the social aspect of that cultural heritage. Then there's a physical racial aspect of that heritage. Then there's a whole nother layer of religion. Of course, all these things equal culture anyways. But then there's also this thing, which I don't think many of us touch upon, is the immigration cycle that we came on. And we all have come at probably different times into different places in this country. Most of us are transplants to the Bay Area. Not everybody, you won't find as many natives to the Bay Area as much as you would find transplants to the Bay Area, right? And so I'll just give you a simple story. When we came to the United States, we came on what was called the knowledgeable worker immigration, right? Which was 60s and 70s. They were chasing Asians to come. And I mean here, Asians, literally the larger term Asians, to come to the United States because of the knowledgeable workforce. They wanted scientists, they wanted doctors, they wanted the engineers, because they need to complement that, knowledge base for these industries to get ahead. Well, Then comes later the same people from that same countries, but now they've come on a different immigration cycle. Those cultures have also changed, right? So there's such a variety here that I think for everybody listening, it is simply not that we're Asian and that defines us. There are so many different dimensions to that that make us so very unique to each other. But then there are some underlying, sentiments that are common. And when we came to the US, we were literally in the midst of Midwest. There was very, very little diversity. And for our case, if you were just minority and a different, you were just connected. You were united just on that basis, right? And then when I came to California, oh my goodness, I land at the airport, never seen this much diversity in my life, except my college, because we had international students. I'm seeing brown people everywhere. And I say that brown people because I can say that, as you know, but in terms of just minorities, and I'm sitting there saying, Sat Sri Akal, Namaste, hello, and whatever, She, how are you, whatever, ni hao, any words I knew. And people are like, do we know you? I'm like, no, but I've never seen this much diversity in my life. This is like, I hit the jackpot, but this is the way I looked upon it because I was deprived of that growing up. But that isn't the way everybody looks at it. And just summing it up, I think that we all have come from unique experiences, and just being the country or the religion we practice is in itself not enough to define who we are and the challenges we face.
Mm-hmm. That's very true. We have Miss Sarah, and then you have just maybe 1 minute for each.
Yeah, I can add a few my own experience. I felt like I had a very similar experience as some of the folks here. I think I didn't get born here. I actually came here as a student. I didn't plan to stay here either. I had this whole plan figured out. I'm gonna get a degree. I went to Europe, get my postdoc. I'm going back to my own country. So I remember maybe my 5th year, I was at America, and I went to New York one day. I was in a hotel lobby. I think I was in a bathroom, was just touching up on my makeup, ready to go to the next event. And someone just came out of the bathroom. I didn't see that lady earlier, and just shouted at me, saying, "Go back to your country." I was not offended, just so you know. This story is not the usual story. You will feel like offended. I was like, yeah, that's my plan. And she was stunned. She didn't expect that from me. But I was completely, I would say, detached from a lot of the discussion about diversity, about discrimination entirely, because I felt like I'm here only as a guest. I don't care if people think differently about me, because I don't plan to stay here. Doesn't matter, it doesn't hurt me, right? But then I met my husband, who was American. And then that changed my plan, because instead of going to Europe, I actually stayed in the Bay Area and got a job. And then during the time I stayed with him, we had lots of discussion on all sorts of stuff, because we just found different family background. We religiously is different. Many things were different. We just discussed a lot about that. And over the time, I realized, oh, actually, in the eyes of others, I do have identity. That's the first time I realized that is such a word. Like, I didn't realize that at all in my entire 20-year life as a human being on the planet Earth. And then that triggered me to think more deeply, hey, what do I want to be? Now, fast forward, very recently, I actually became American. I actually can be American 4 or 5 years ago. I didn't, because I had that huge sort of debate with myself, like, who do I want to be? But then once I changed that mindset, I realized I'm gonna stay. And then I start seeing all those issues really from that sort of perspective, especially the recent events. It just really made me heartbroken. And I think, like, since I'm gonna stay, this is not my country. Now I want to do something for my country. I think this is not right. So I joined the battle, and then the rest is the history. So just want to share, like, it also takes a journey. I think I totally agree with, Harvey earlier, saying, like, this is the journey, right? This is a difference of a window. I think everyone has their own individual story and about their thinking when they want to join the cause.
Yeah, thank you. Sarah, do you want to just add a few words?
Yeah, and one thing that's really resonating with me is when I was born, my parents were first-generation immigrants. My dad was in the military from the Philippines. Joining as the military, my mom was expert with numbers, college degree, born and raised here in San Jose, grew up in the South Bay. and we were tied to very close to like military roots as well as Catholic roots, as that's where a lot of my relatives and my families and folks that we knew from the Philippines, that's what they knew, and that's how they built community here. And I was born with a lot of conservative values. If you could imagine being part of the military and being brought up as Catholic, to this day, I'm still identified as Catholic. I didn't realize how much of those values were instilled in me and were just deep rooted in me until I came out as a queer trans Filipino woman. So I identify as a transgender woman, and once I started my exploration with gender identity, sexual orientation, all that, it felt like I was going against the grain, against a lot of the values that were instilled upon me when I was growing up here. So it's a very unique experience, how much privilege I had, as someone that lived mostly in a male body for most of my life, and then going and choosing to be authentic and choosing my own life, how much that was against a lot of the things that my parents instilled in me when they immigrated here.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sarah. I mean, I really enjoyed all the stories you shared with our audience, because I felt it's so important for them to know. I mean, not just your work, and also where you are coming from. So, and your background, and you being an Asian American. And I mean, this actually has a lot to do with the things you are working on right now in social and racial justice. And the fight against AAPI hate is such a long commitment. I call it a movement. It's a lasting movement, right? We'll keep doing that, until all the racism is gone. And there's a deeper history, I think, behind the current crisis. So recently, the city of San Jose formally apologized to the Chinese community for its role in racism and violence against them in the past. So it was in the news, and I went to the event myself. I was really moved. So in your opinion, how important it is to actually teach people history when we are fighting against hate? Because a lot of times, really, we have to go back. We have to step back a little bit. Hey, that's a history. There's a continuation there. So can you share also example of what your organization has done to make people learn more about AAPI history? I'm a writer, so I mean, stories are very, very important to me. So Vincent, I know you are very experienced and very dynamic community leader. And I know you also believe in the power of storytelling. Yeah. So I wonder if you can start, to answer this question and tell us how you tell stories in the fight against AAPI hate.
Well, I think when we tell stories is a way to connect with people, and it's how we process information. And these stories relate to the individual experiences that we've all had, and whether that's battling prejudice or discrimination or physical violence inflicted by another person. But these are also stories about how we've struggled and fought as communities against structures and institutions. And so when we think about the stories that we need to tell, we need to hear our individual personal stories, but we also need to understand stories of our communities and stories of our institutions. And so that apology that was made in San Jose was not an apology just to any one person. It's an apology to a community, and really it's an apology to all of us, right? And so when we think about the need to not only combat interpersonal violence, but to address structural inequity, one of the ways that we move towards that is by thinking at a systemic level. And so one of the things that Chinese for Affirmative Action has done with many, many other groups, including San Francisco State University Asian American Studies, which is a partner with us in Stop API Hate, is to really advocate for the teaching of more inclusive histories, more inclusive pedagogy, teaching of ethnic studies in our public schools, right? And so that we're not only learning a very Eurocentric version of American history, but we're learning about how Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders have been in this country, have struggled have experienced discrimination, and whether that's historic and related to imperialism or colonialism, Pacific Islanders or Philippines, or more recent history, including the internment of Japanese Americans, the red baiting of Chinese folks during the Red Scare, but also very recent, including not only the last two years, but how, for example, the post 9/11 war on terror really impacted the MMSA communities here in the United States. So I think that the stories we all have are so important. And then we also have to tell community stories and community history and to institutionalize it so it not happenstance, and to also link these to stories of other communities of color, of women, basically all those who've been marginalized, in order to bring more awareness and spur more action.
Yeah, thank you very much, Vincent. How about the other speakers? Any stories to share?
I would like to bring something up, and I think this is kind of probably picking up from what Vincent brought up. So, and I'll give a little bit of history about the Sikh community, as I am from the Sikh faith tradition. Sikhs have been in the United States since the 1890s. And so when we think about, contributions to this nation, we have to remember that we blanketly say immigrants have made this country, but it's really important, as you said, why the storytelling is important, because it gives examples and helps people have tangible, ways to relate to a story and to that experience. So in the 1890s, folks came from the East and the West, and then in various different forms. But at that time, as we all being from the Asian community, knew that Asians were considered second-class citizens. Whether you were brown, whether you were East Asian, whether you were North Asian, it didn't matter. You were considered a second-class citizen. If you were not considered the common white man, you could not own land, you could not become a citizen, you could not do a lot of these things. At that time, there was one gentleman named Bhagat Singh Thind. He actually challenged the norms and said, look, if I'm going to join the army, I should have the right to become a citizen. So he helped fight that battle for a lot of the Asians. Now, why is this important? Because between us, it helps us build that relationship of understanding amongst us, but also helps build the understanding across the United States that civil rights movement did not start in the 50s and 60s. It's been going on since the beginning of time, if you think about America as a whole, right? Now comes to a point where, what did that mean for the Sikh community? So the Sikh community eventually fought these battles from the East and the West. They came down the West Coast, and they actually brought in the skills from South Asia. At that time, farming was the greatest benefit. But if I didn't tell this story to many of the folks that I give Sikh awareness presentations to, they would have no clue that they brought the irrigation canals that give the state of California its rich farms. Without those irrigation canal technology and that innovative models, we could not be the flourished state that we are. Now, if I can go out there and I could appear like I'm saying, hey, give my community credit, but that's not the intention. The intention is to show how this community has contributed to the well-being and the success of the overall community. Because if I don't tell that story, I'm in my community of whether it's the Sikhs, whether it's South Asians, whether it's anybody from that region, is considered an outsider. Just like it comes to the Chinese community, just like the Japanese community, the Filipinos, Vietnamese, all of us have contributed to this society here. But until we bring these stories to light, we are not considered the norm, we are considered outsiders. And that's why it's really critical for these stories to be told. So we can say, look, we are a grassroots community. Actually, Asians are as much a grassroots community of this nation as are Hispanics, as are the Irish, as are the Italians, but we forget because we don't talk about those things. And second part of the storytelling, why it's important. We also have faced different experiences. As Chen said, that she came at a different time, I came at a different time. And there's recent immigrants that came from the IT, the H-1B, wave, which have very personal different experiences, right? But, if I don't talk about that, the experiences that they bring with them and how that affects them, then I'm not going to be able to do a good job in creating awareness. Many Sikhs are still facing the trauma of the genocide of 1984, right? Now, it's not a debate whether it happened or not. It's a question of how we speak about it. And it doesn't happen very often, but it actually affects the communities in the Bay Area very significantly because they carry that pain with them till today. It's just like it was yesterday for them, right? So their interactions with other people become very timid. Now, I try in my Sikh awareness presentations to talk about the various highlights of the Sikh community so people can understand that background from this culture's perspective, but also some of the pain that they're bringing with them. That's just natural because as some came as refugees, as we talked about his parents, they still are part of our community today. And we need to be sensitive to the different experiences that they bring because they will also relate to us differently. So it goes more both ways, one for the external audience and one for our internal audiences as well.
Yeah.
Actually, Habir brought up some points that I thought were just phenomenal, and I would love to connect. I mean, and just to piggyback and support them. I mean, one first question is, I actually need to know what this, but I actually don't know what the 1984 genocide is. I would love to learn more about that, right? And that history, though, is so telling as to the experiences, right? I mean, what is part of creating the Asian American experience or just the Asian in America experience? It's how we were collectively treated, regardless of our unique backgrounds, regardless of our own unique experiences, right? Many Filipinos have a military background because of being, a colony and serving in World War II. The Vietnamese have a lot of a military background because of the colony, but because of the Vietnam War, right? There's some shared experiences. There's also some quite unique ones. For example, those who came to the States more recently under work visas or under H-1B visas, where that the traumas carried forward, but perhaps in a different way, right? And so all of that gets washed away in part of this kind of epidemic of anti-Asian hate, right? People, we get hated on because we're Asian, but without any kind of acknowledgement of there's all different experiences here because Asian is such a big, broad term and big, broad experience. And so learning this history, I think, is absolutely critical to fighting racism, right? It's acknowledging and learning that there is a lot of different impacts, that there's a lot of different benefits. There's a lot of different achievements that Asian Americans have brought into this country. And also to piggyback off of like Harbir's point, when she was saying like, hey, we don't get the recognition for recognition, is to like learn and hear, share stories. Hey, you know what? I say it's the same thing, right? Recognize the achievements, recognize the accomplishments because it is part of the history. And it's part of creating the American identity and American experience. So I'm all about that, like share and recognize. We should absolutely do that and uplift each other. So I'm all for that. I mean, VAR, in recognizing the role that history plays, right? We've tried to support education in specific ways. I mean, we have a particular focus on the Vietnamese experience. And so our programming, of course, focuses on that. We have a youth program where we try to focus on cultural awareness, right? We actually teach local history, right? Like, hey, what's the background and the history of Little Saigon, right? What's the history of what happened at the Grand Century Mall, right? Like these gathering centers, we want to use that because there is a local history behind it, and it ties into how we identify ourselves today. And so our youth program does sessions at Grand Century Mall or at Vietnam Town. We do it at the cultural center, right? We do that because these spaces, we've been able to get these spaces that we've craved and demanded and fought for a long time, so that we can have the opportunity to do what Harbir said, to do what Vincent was mentioning, right? Which is to share our experiences, share our stories, and have it be recognized and acknowledged as part of the American experience. One kind of thing we hear about the experience, right? In terms of just how different backgrounds, different histories impact us. Even in the Vietnamese community, there is a generational divide, right? There are those who remember and survived the war and come over, and their experiences are absolutely colored by that trauma, right? And it leads them to, at least many elders, and I don't want to see them as in it's all the same, but at least many elders to kind of have this sense of eternal gratitude, right? We survived the war, we fought communism, the communists forced us out of the country, and America took us in, so we now are eternally grateful, and we must be eternally grateful, right? And you'll hear some folks say, you know what, yeah, any country can always improve, but America is the best country because they took us in. But then you see the experiences of younger folks, right, who were born here, maybe who had a better opportunities to learn more history. And so you see more younger folks stepping out to support the Black Lives Matter movement, stepping out to talk about the need to understand our history and the need to build solidarity. And it's because we grew up where, part of it is we didn't necessarily survive a war. We see the traumas and the impacts that impact us. But we also have a different experience. We see more of the struggles that happened here, right? We see and we know about how the KKK targeted Vietnamese fisher folk out in the Gulf Coast, right? We grew up here knowing and seeing how many folks were afraid of any Asian person, and in the 80s, and blaming Asian people for the economic turmoil that America was going through, right? And because we experienced that, we actually I think we have a perspective that says, hey, I'm grateful for my life. I am. I don't know if my life would be the same if I was born in Vietnam, but I also recognize there's a ton of work to do, right? And I think that is something that, and that's why, we'll go back to that point, right? We got to support ethnic studies. We have to be able to support programming that exposes youth to this information, to these other experiences, because we need a more holistic view of how we approach bringing change to the country, change to our communities, and a more holistic view about how we build relationships up between communities and ensure that discrimination is not tolerated and that we'll stand together and united when we fight that kind of hateful ideology.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really wish we had a whole day to talk about this because it's such an important topic. And also when it comes to education, I have a lot to say myself. But let's move on to the next question, and which is continuation, actually, our previous discussion. Okay. And all of you have talked about your different experience and different upbringing, right? So when we say Asian community or Asian Americans, we all understand they're really broad terms, right? Within the community, there's so many different ethnicities, so many different identities, so many different stories, right? Just take the Society of Heart's Delight as an example. Majority of our members came to the US in adulthood. Okay, so they are all bilingual. And their cultural identity can be quite different from someone whose ancestor has been here for several generations, where you just kind of mentioned that, right? So within our community, within the sub-community, we still have many different experiences, many different identities. So here I wanted to hear your personal experience in advocating for your specific community and for your specific cause. I try to kind of narrow down a little bit here. And Sarah, I know you have done a lot of wonderful work for the LGBTQ community. So I wonder if you can start with this one.
Yeah, I would love to, and thank you. One thing I'm thinking about as I continue to hear your stories and such wonderful stories and recommendations from y'all is from my experience, really, the reason why I work with a lot of LGBTQ organizations, I call myself a professional queer. This is something that I don't do I used to do it as like community service work, but now it's just my day job is also within LGBTQ plus equity and social justice. And the reason why I feel that this is important is because I think that there is a lot of lives that get missed, especially when it comes to sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression, specifically when it comes to our own ethnicities. This year alone, I looked at, I'm always like, I'm inundated with data. As a data analyst, this is kind of like my life. And looking at this year, around 46 transgender Americans were murdered due to anti-trans hate and brutality and violence. And that's a number that is, well, first off, 2021, it looks to be the most dangerous year for trans folks in America, bar none, and it keeps on going up. Last year, it was 44 transgender Americans murdered. This year, 46. 2 of which here within the past year lived within the South Bay. And this is something that I want to share in terms of the statistics that are out there. I feel that when it comes to storytelling, the stories of queer, trans, LGBTQ folks within the community often go missed, often go erased. And when we're talking about our ancestry, bringing our whole selves, bringing who we are into America, we have to think about what's actually being told. As a Filipino American, my heritage also includes the babaylan, which are spiritual healers of different sexual identities and gender identities, sexual orientations and gender identities. We have goddesses that are trans that were erased in terms of just being told in the narrative of my own heritage. This is something I did not know about until I was learning a little bit my own intersectionality. And you look back at Asian cultures, we're talking about the Papatine in Indonesia, right? We're talking about the Hijra in South Asian cultures, right? Even in America, we're talking about Two-Spirit. In Latin America, we're talking about the Mushe. Like, these are identities, trans identities that have been erased and not talked about when it comes to the history books. So when you're talking about like critical race theory, you also have to think about the contributions of queer, trans, people of color. We have to talk about the contributions of our own history, because what's being shared, what's being in our history books is not inclusive of queer, trans stories. And this is what we're looking to do to make sure that not only do we have these stories, but support those LGBTQ community members that often go erased, unrecognized, or not respected within their own ethnicity. I love those stories. Those stories are impactful. And let's face it, when it comes to the lives that are truly affected by anti-trans, anti-gay ideology, we have to look at our own identities, and Black and brown folks are at it at the worst. But again, I looked at recent data with this week being Trans Awareness Week. 19 Filipinos were murdered in the Philippines, around 20 folks murdered in South Asia. We really have to think about the data that's out there and think about what we need to do to uplift the most marginalized communities within our own ethnic groups.
Wow, thank you. My goodness. Fan, can I step in here? I know this is, I think, the topic you want me to talk about. So Van specifically asked me to do some kind of provide some background, just because it was probably unknown, and I really cannot tell you how much I appreciate this platform. And Sarah, thank you so much for that. I did not know about the stories of the gods and goddesses and how that ties into the history, but I think you brought up something very critical here, how it plays into what we do today and why we do it, right? And I think that's the question fans asking us. So from the background, really quickly, I'm just going to give like a 1-minute spiel as much as possible. The Sikh community is originally from South Asia, North South Asia, which is now separated into Pakistan and India. And it originated in the state of Punjab. But Punjabis and Sikhs often are considered synonymous, but they're not. But nevertheless, they are today, of course, all over the world. There's about 25 million of them. Or I should say less. They're about the 5th largest faith tradition. I say faith tradition because religion has some different parameters of how we interpret the word religion. So there are about, we're the 5th largest tradition in the world, and there's no competition here. I'm just making a point. So just there's no competition of who's the biggest and who's not. But just to educate, in the United States, we have about 700,000. Most Sikhs are visible by their uncut hair. They usually wear one of these, men and women, and they wear what's often called a small dagger, but which is really not pointed. It's about this big on their side. They wear long shorts, undershorts, and they always have a comb in their hair. Now, there's reasons for all this, and I'm not here to try to pitch this but I'm trying to give a summary of why this matters. So many people practice this, and they are practicing Sikhs. And as you can see the picture behind me, they're often recognized by the turban. Now, these identities are to combine us to be remembering that we are a beacon of hope, and we're always there to defend the rights of all. That is the purpose of all these elements, is to be a reminder that our job is to stand up for the rights of all human beings, and all religions, all races, and all paths are considered equal. There is no one that is better. Whatever is yours is your path, and that is what you should follow. And that is why it's so very painful when coming from that kind of mindset of Sarbat da Pala, which means Sarbat means all, Pala means benefit or betterment. Coming from that mindset, being misunderstood is very painful, because you're literally putting down your life for the life of others. And as we say in the army, people say in the army, we serve so others may live. Well, the Sikh community's philosophy is that to lift the downtrodden, create equity, ensure that there's equality between women and men, as well as all in between as we identify ourselves to be. And then at the same time, no matter what race you are. So there's a very famous saying by Voltaire, I may not agree with what you have to say, but I will fight for your right to say it. That's a real double-edged sword, and it's a very painful sword at times, actually, right? So when you come from that faith tradition, and in most young men in India, and now women, are often part of the Sikh men and women are part of the Indian military. And yet they are considered and treated as a threat, whether you're in the United States or in India. Why? Because there is this independent mindset. And so since 9/11, people have seen the spikes in hate crimes. And that is because they interpret the turban or the facial hair to be similar to those that were potentially involved in various types of forms of terrorism. But yet it didn't start in 9/11. Guess when it started? It started anytime there was anything happening in the world. My dad was called Khomeini, Ayatollah. So you guys remember the Iran-Contra. Wherever we went, he's like, go back home. And my dad and my brother were like, cool. I was like, Miss, shield maiden here trying to protect my parents and, and saying, well, you can't look at them that way. So I wasn't very aware of what was happening to me because I was so aware of how they were being treated. And then came the Gulf War, right? You understand that. Then it was about, hey, go back to the Gulf. Then it was 9/11. Many families were killed. Many families had lost their sons and their daughters as the post the backlash after 9/11. There was a family that lost two sons, the Sodi family. One son was shot in Phoenix, Arizona, because of his turban and his facial hair. The other one was shot in San Francisco. Just imagine that. That family lost two sons. But what does this come down to? That for the Sikh community who believes in Sarbat Palah, and that they don't have understanding and solidarity by their Asian brothers and sisters or the other minorities, it is so very painful because we have elders being beat up in San Jose, in the East Bay. You heard of the FedEx shootings. Majority of them were Sikh, and yet FBI does not call this out yet. So why am I trying to tell you all this except to say, when the philosophy is that you must serve the community and think about the betterment for all, it is the hardest thing when you serve and you still are misunderstood.
Wow, indeed. I mean, what a stories. And I really like what you said about community service provides happiness and it's essential to our well-being. I think it's so well said. Especially these days, I kind of felt, I encourage my kids are still young, but I said, we all needed to contribute to the society. We all needed to do more volunteering for our community. So while I was researching about United Against Hate Week, I actually found a diverse list of events in San Jose and other South Bay cities. And I was actually very happy to see all these things are happening. You're like teen rights, writing workshop, community gathering, and backyard discussion, and also like book club discussion, and even game night against hate. I know my kids will love that, game night against hate, right? So I see all the communities, they're trying to do something, right? Do something to fight, to fight the hate, fight all the discrimination. So I think the audience, I talked to some people before this event, some of my neighbors. So I think people really like to hear some events your organizations have put together in your fight against hate, against AAPI hate, right? And I know Zhen, I attended the attack for AAPI, the rally in April, and it was terrific. It was so many fantastic stories. And for people who kind of said they were kind of introvert, but you know what? They spoke up because it was so important for them to share their stories with the community. So I wonder if you can tell us about the rally.
Yeah, it was a very inspiring event. It's actually happened within a week. It was literally after a lot of those anti-Asian hate crime happened. People just start talking to each other, and roughly 32 community leaders, and most of us don't know each other before this event, basically ping one another And then we just quickly form a social group and then start talking about what can we do? What can we do? This is really horrible. And then one person just mentioned like, hey, there's a lot of community making, sort of efforts trying to address it. For example, Stop AAPI Hate, that Vincent, you guys did a great job like inspiring a lot of us. And then folks like, there's not much going on within the tech. Like, what is going on? We are tech folks. We need to do something. The big company are not issuing any statement. That is weird. And then so we're like, okay, let's just do a grassroots thing. So roughly 20-something community leaders just like came together, say, hey, let's do a rally. And then we're like, okay, if we want to do a rally, we need to invite some speakers. Everyone's like, yeah, I will invite these people. And the other like, I will go talk to my VP. The other one like, yeah, I'm gonna talk to my manager tomorrow and encourage him to come. So I dragged my manager, who was a VP at Netflix, to come to the event, and a few others did the same. So very quickly, within like actually 5 days, we put together a guest list. And we start like, okay, someone like who was a designer, like I can make a poster, let me start that. And another engineer is like, hey, I will start the website, let me do that. And a startup actually CEO saying like, hey, we actually have a platform, we can host this event. Just let us know like what we can do. And so she rallied her entire team to help us make this happen. So 5 days later, the event happened. We had more than 800 people actually showed up, including a lot of the top tier companies, VPs and executives actually come and then tell their own stories. Some of the stories they shared was really inspiring and touching, actually. I remember one of the venture capitalists actually joined. He was already doing a lot of work on LinkedIn and in his community. He's just like, he's a very big person. He's like, I'm a very big person. I thought all these years and I'm working hard, trying to make things happen, trying to elevate my community. But still, these days when I go down the street, I don't feel that big anymore. People have those like, hatred speech towards him. He's like, it's really sad. He felt like whatever I did, it just seemed to matter. Only how I look matters. I remember that. It was just really resonating, right? As I shared earlier, it's like, sometimes the identity is not something we try to find for ourselves from the very beginning. You actually see through other people's eyes and realize, oh, I'm considered as X because how I look. And that's the moment you realize, okay, what is going on? Why I'm treated this way just because I look like this, right? And that's just a very sad moment. So that rally really was like, I think it's a supporting event, just for all the people who has been suffering in the past few months, sort of come together virtually, online, sharing their thoughts. A couple speakers actually cried when they were talking about their sort of stories. It was really touching. And afterwards, we actually decided to keep this going on. So we started a hackathon afterwards. And we actually invited Vincent to be one of our speakers, who actually shared a lot of history of the AAPI community. Was really helpful because when we want to do something, we're trying to do a hackathon, do some project to help. It's actually sometimes hard to find what the root cause, right? I think the history actually really tell us what the root cause were, and so that we can do something really sort of beneficial to hopefully solve some of that, if not all.
Yeah, it was a wonderful story. It just shows the power of being together and the power of the community. And especially you guys did that within days. I just cannot believe it, because it looked like you guys spent months on that event, because it was so well organized. And all those speeches were just fantastic, and I really enjoyed that. The whole event really energized me, and I shared the videos with so many of my friends and so many of my neighbors. I think it was just fantastic. So when I was telling my friends and neighbors about tonight's event, I hope some of my neighbors are here tonight, because they told me earlier they would be tuning in. And actually quite a few of my neighbors and my friends said, you know what, a lot of times we don't really experience outright hate, but it's that kind of subtle comments, right? The implicit bias, the unconscious bias that sometimes gets stuck with me, right? And then I feel really sad. So this bias, such bias, even it's subtle, but you know what, it can divide a community. I think it's happening a lot these days. People will say, oh, you know what, I'm not racist. I have nothing against Asian communities, but they would say something kind of negative, right? Sometimes it doesn't sound very a big deal, but you know what, when you think about it, it's just really wrong, right? And it's a comment stays with you. So I wonder if you can, talk a little bit about that, and have you or people you're close to encountered such bias, such racism in your daily life or at work? And any advice you can share with us about how to act in such situations? I know people say, oh, you can be funny and you can fight back, but you know what? It's not easy, especially when you're caught at the moment. Sometimes you don't know what to say. It happened to a couple of my friends. They said that they were so shocked, they didn't know what to say, right? So I wonder if you have such experience, and do you have any advice for our audience?
Well, I would love to jump in on this, because one of the things we've done at CAA and at Stop API Hate is to allow community members to report to us what is happening. And we began this, in March of last year, and now nearly or roughly 10,000 people have shared their stories with us. And as a result, we've been able to create a powerful collective voice, and then to insist that this issue be acknowledged. And so in the course of about a year and a half, we've doubled the percentage of Americans who now acknowledge that Asian Americans do face racism, right? And a lot of Americans still don't even know who Asian Americans are, but we've been able to double the percent who understand now that we have a problem, right? And I think that that's progress. But an important part of the progress is to understand, well, what is the nature of these 10,000 reports? And one of the things that's very important to acknowledge is that the vast majority of them are not crimes, right? And so though there needs to be individual accountability, many of the incidents are not matters for the criminal justice system. So if someone shouts at you something racist or sexist and you call the police and the police come, the police will say there's nothing I can do, and they will be right. Right? If you are at Walgreens or CVS or Costco or Walmart or Target, any big box retail, and employees shout something offensive to you, or customers do, and the store doesn't do anything, these are not necessarily crimes, right? But they are traumatic, right? They are hurtful, and left unaddressed, they will escalate into more serious forms of hate, and they will proliferate because it will continue to be normalized, right? So one of the things that we're really urging is to, instead of just trying to, in my view, ineffectively police our way out of hate, is to address that how safety actually looks starts with first healing, like centering the healing of people who are impacted. Then looking at stronger civil rights laws, right? Because even though they may not be a matter for the criminal justice system, you can enforce civil rights laws so that workplace discrimination and bias is not allowed, so that harassment is not permitted, so that schools do not accept bullying and racialized bullying. So there's many, many things we can do from our institutions, from our laws, especially on the civil side, to not only protect all communities from bias and discrimination and hate, but actually prevent it from escalating. Right? So these so-called, smaller incidents do matter a lot, right? And the research we have also shows that Asian Americans have been more traumatized by the rise in anti-Asian hate than the COVID pandemic, right? That parents are afraid of sending their kids back to school. Seniors aren't going to grocery stores because they're worried for their safety, so that these things, even if they're not, again, classified as crimes, are affecting the way we are able to live, right? So I think it's so important to not, believe that these matters are not important, right? And that there's so much, again, that we can do by healing, through solidarity, by demanding systemic change, and whether that's at a place of work, a place of business, on public transportation, what we see in the media, all of it. There's so much power that we do have.
Yeah, thank you, Vincent. I think the first step is just to speak up and speak out. A lot of people kind of hide and they just kind of felt they don't have anybody to share with, or think this is not a big deal, also not big enough for them to report it. But I think it's very important for everyone to tell people about what they have encountered and share the stories. So anyone else, anybody else wanted to?
I would love just to say
something?
one little piece to that,
Yeah,
because
sure.
to just, when we ask people why they report to us, like we don't share our information with law enforcement. The main reason people report to us because they want to see things change, right? They want things to be better for their kids. They want things to be better for their parents, right? And so I think we do have to, say that, yes, when you speak up, it does make a difference, right? And also to be able to hear that other people are also suffering as well, right? Not just AAPI communities, but other communities as well. And this is why solidarity becomes so important, and that we do not want to devolve into a situation where, community members are blaming other community members, when in reality, like, we are all in this together.
Yeah, I think to add it on that, I think it's important to capture the data. It's also important to visualize the data, because a chart, a picture worth 1,000 words. And then one project that actually come out of the hackathon I mentioned earlier was called Hate Crime Tracker. There's a dedicated team of like more than 10 engineers and designers and product manager working together to create such a tool. We actually recently got in touch with Vincent, your team, about this tool, right? And then try to see if we can combine that visualization with the data you have. I think it's important for us to sort of show people what is going on, and also maybe using social media, other channel to sort of like tell the story. And also hopefully with all our work, we can showcase eventually those cases will go down instead of keep going up. So I think it's important for us, just like how we combat with the COVID, right? All the trackers and visualization has been really helpful. I think become like a daily tool for a lot of us. I certainly checking in on COVID cases at a regular basis. How are we doing in this area, in US, in the rest of the world, so that we can decide what to do. I actually imagine that sort of a tool, visualization, will help all our communities combat those things more systematically, right? It's no longer just one story and another story, it's all anecdotal evidence. We actually can show them the data. Here, is what's going on. I actually love what Sarah was sharing earlier, right? Those data really speak the truth. What is the severity of the situation? And without that, it's like people just, oh, here's the story. But maybe that's just an isolated event. In my neighborhood, it never happened, right? All people tend to think that way. So we have to show them, no, it is happening, and it's happening everywhere. Here's how severe it is.
If I could just add that with Vincent and first of all, Vincent and I guess Chen, we should definitely talk afterwards, because we were talking about something similar as well, to do a data tracker. But I think there's a couple of things we got to really hone in on. One was recognizing there's a lot that happens between what is considered against the law and what is still wrong, right? Wrong does not equate to it is going to have a law that says you cannot do this, and therefore there are some ramifications or consequences. So I really appreciate that you really touched upon that. And I want to give you some stats that 2021 is considered to be actually the worst in recent history in terms of hate crimes, and specifically against Asians, right? Now, after 9/11, it took years for organizations like Sikh Coalition and SOLDEF, and actually even including, I think, I'm forgetting the name, CARE, which is from the Islamic Relations Organization, to really work with the FBI to force them to start documenting this stuff. Until then, it wasn't happening, right? So they actually basically came back with some recent stats from 2016. And right afterwards, they said that the hate crimes increased 5 times for these 3 organizations. They didn't have the resources to even keep up with the hate crimes. And that was what was considered, as Vincent differentiated, what was against the law, okay? What was considered an official hate crime. Now, since then, this year, they have said, if there's a community that is going to be the one that is probably the target against the most, the Sikh community, apparently, for whatever the reasons are, I mean, I can speak to them, but I won't just sit here and educate everybody, but is now considered to be one of, if not the highest and most targeted community in the nation, because they're visibly, obviously different. Now, when we look at this, we don't talk about all the stuff that happens in between. And so what can we do? 67% of the Sikh youth will be bullied in school. That's a statistic that has been from the basis of studies. But how do we all work together amongst each other to share that data? because it doesn't stop there. I'm one type of minority, but there are others as well. As we said, the Vietnamese community, the Filipino community, the Chinese community, the Japanese community, we all have data. We need to start working together with each other. Not only is it non-Asians, but within ourselves. So when it comes to how do we stand up for each other, solidarity is so very important. I cannot stop and pause enough here. And 2012, there was the Oak Creek shootings of the Oak Creek Gurdwara, the Sikh temple. The whole nation was shook because people died. There were shootings in the mass in the middle of the day, okay? San Jose was the first. Now imagine, San Jose was the first to hold an anti-hate event. But since then, I don't see that level of grandness of us coming together. Me physically showing up to something that Chen is doing is very, very important. People must realize, please don't assume solidarity is like, yeah, somebody else will do it. No, you showing up matters. I know Huey's done events in San Jose. I think it was 3 years ago or 2 years ago, Huey had you were hosting an event, and I remember this. I couldn't make it, but I actually insisted that somebody should physically show up at that event because I know I look different. But when I show up, it makes a difference to the collective impact that your event has. When somebody says something wrong at the office, you do have to stand up. Please don't wait for somebody else. That's what solidarity looks like.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. It's almost like actually you knew I'm going to actually talk about solidarity in my next question. So due to the time restraint, so we have the one last question before we give the time to the audience, okay? And the last question is for the whole panel. So I do want to hear your insight and your thought. So of course, the last question is about tangible actions, right? And then we talk about solidarity. We talk about the different communities. We have our distinct, unique perspectives. But on the other hand, we have a lot of things in common. We can work together, right? And also it's a perfect time to really, to really transform negativity, I think, into positive change. We already see that happening in the community, right? So what can we do to build solidarity across communities and really foster a culture of inclusion and a sense of belonging for all of us? I know it's a very big question, right? But let's say, the Christmas is around the corner. Santa is listening to our conversation right now, and he will grant you, all of you, one wish, any wish, regarding building an inclusive and equitable community. So what would your wish be? Tell Santa, and Santa is going to make it to you tomorrow. So Hui, do you want to start? Because we talked a little bit on the phone about that.
Yeah, actually, and I think too that this question just transitions really well to the point that I was going to make too. In terms of tangible action items, right? I think there are a few things that I just want to try to touch on quickly. We talked a lot about data, right? Data is critical. We have to collect it, but it also has to reflect our experiences, right? And so one of the things that VAR has pushed for is that we need to start disaggregating our data, right? We need to really start recognizing and acknowledging the individual experiences of these communities. Example is during the pandemic, Santa Clara County was tracking COVID cases by, just large groups, right? Latinx, Asian American, African American, right? And throughout the first 6 months of the pandemic, everything looked hunky-dory for the API category, right? It was like, hey, COVID cases are below average, it looks like everything in the API community is doing fine. However, come November of 2020, this was the first time that we actually got a chance to see disaggregated data, right? And we learned for the first time that COVID-19 was devastating Vietnamese and Filipino households, right? For the first time, we learned that. And it wasn't that, and this is not, to say that we were suffering just as much as, I don't think we can deny that Black and brown communities were just devastated the most about this. But when we started learning that right behind Black and brown communities were Vietnamese and Filipino households, that big light bulb came on of, we could have been trying to prevent this so much more if we knew going in that this was a problem, and we didn't, right? And so that's one of the things that would actually push about data, that we need to disaggregate, because if we all get lumped together, our individual struggles just disappear. One of the other things I want to touch on too is, Harbeer kind of hit the nail on the head here with the solidarity, right? When we see something, we all got to find ways to support each other, right? On Sunday, there was a massive march out in Los Gatos, because of the racist treatment that Mayor Mariko Sayok faced at the hands of just kind of racist conspiracy theorists, anti-vaxxer, anti-maskers who were, at some point beyond being racist, they were targeting her LGBTQ son, right? And we had to stand up together for that. We had to show up together for that, right? And I live in San Jose, I live in Berryessa. This event happened in Los Gatos, right? It's not close, but it's not so far that we can't show out and support the people in our community who are being targeted in this way. I mean, the same thing should happen if it's in Milpitas. If a Latina in Milpitas is feeling discriminated against or feeling challenged, and it's something that we can do because it's something that's catching our attention, and we should try to find these opportunities and support each other. And the last point I would just tap on is I think we also need to be introspective. We need to look at our own habits and the things that we do that may further biases or prejudices. I mean, look, I'm say up front, when I was younger, I used to say that anything that was bad, I was like, that's gay. I was one of those guys, It wasn't until a friend told me, hey, you know what? That's not, that makes me feel bad, right? Because you're equating something bad to how I identify. Once I learned that, it shook me, and I thought, you know what? I can't do that anymore. And not only that, in conversations with my friends and family, if somebody said that too, I would turn around and be like, hey, I don't really see how being gay has anything to do with what you just talked about. So maybe we should stop using that, right? So it's not just solidarity in those large moments, in those large interactions. It's solidarity in those one-on-ones as well. Because we look at internally too, about the biases that we may hold and how we address that to ourselves. I think it also reflects outward, right? Once we can see how we are perpetuating, oppression, and then we change it with ourselves, and it makes it easier to carry forward and do that for others as well.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
So anyone else? Because this is for the whole panel, so everyone will need to answer this question about solidarity.
Yeah, waiting for somebody else to have the opportunity, but I didn't hear anybody, so I'll jump in. So there are a few things. I want to throw out some names of some organizations because I'm big into collaboration. If anybody knows me, I'm just like, let's take the whole, everybody should rise up together. There are a few organizations that are doing a lot of critical work. Sikh Coalition, SOLDEF, which is the Sikh American Legal Defense Education Fund. It's a mouthful, so SOLDEF. There are local organizations that are working across multiple communities. CARE is one of them as well. And I would say also the arts. There's an organization called Sikh Lens, and they focus on Asian experiences and specifically from the Sikh point of view, but also the Asian experiences. I'm building films and supporting the arts. And by saying this, I'm trying to help touch upon the things that we can do as individuals is to promote the arts as well. There's Core Films. There's a local group, and what we do with each other, we consider each other ambassadors of our communities. So it's called Stand Up for Asians. So what we do is it's simple things like even when was the Shang-Chi film came out, we rented out the whole theater and made sure that we all came to support that film, though, it wasn't something that you consider something that is a tangible, against hate. No, but those are subtle things that soften the differences between each other, because at the ultimate goal is for us to close that gap that creates this feeling of difference. And what does that difference ultimately concern us about? It concerns us because we're afraid. We have a sense of distrust. So we have to break that distrust because it's built by ideology, it's built by our socioeconomic reasons, it's built by our immigration cycles, it's built by our fundamental unknowns and therefore fears about things that we don't understand from our cultural perspective. And then it comes to our philosophies on immigration in general, right? So when I think about these things, I think about trust issues. So for us to develop that trust, we need to do more awareness at the public level. We need to do more arts and film and media. We need to focus on bringing more of that together. We need to come to each other's events and be ambassadors for all humanity, not just for ourselves. And I know that sounds very very ideological, but that's just the belief I live by. And I'm just one of the many. If we all act as a collective ambassadors, let's go to each other's places of history. Let's go to each other's places of worship. Let's go and have a meal together. If we can first understand each other, imagine how we can make that that circle of influence larger, because it is one person at a time. So I touch upon those things with that hope that solidarity and active steps really come to, reaching out to places that have resources to help you. And I mentioned a few names, going to each other's places to understand each other better, and making sure we push more participation in the public space. If we do not force each other to take roles in commissions, on boards, then we actually don't become the norm. And we have to help become the norm, not for ourselves, but the future generations that are coming.
Thank you. How about Sarah?
I feel that, and I love what Vincent and we were bringing up, and what's resonating with me is the sense of healing. And it's not only healing the communities that are afflicted by violence, by trauma, it's also healing within ourselves by our own experienced trauma, healing from the traumas that we've experienced of what it means to be masculine, what it means to be feminine, what it means to be androgynous, what it means to make another man's attractive. If you're a cisgender straight man, and thinking another man's attractive, not stepping back and saying like, oh, whoa, that's gay. Like, I'm not gay. It's breaking that down and finding out where'd that trauma come from. And a lot of times you'll find that it's from these systemic barriers, these institutionalized pieces, institutionalized bias, institutionalized racism, institutionalized misogyny, institutionalized anti-LGBTQ rhetoric. These are things that's within a patriarchy that's meant to empower those who want to stay in power. And we have to really think about what healing looks like for each of us, and healing from our own traumas. If we don't heal from our own traumas, it's really hard for us to really take action. So I do a lot of allyship workshops, y'all. For me, I've always spoke and said, like, it's self-reflection, take action, take accountability, make policy change. It's always that, but there's always this healing that always has to happen if we're going to make any kind of change. And that takes place with the individual. If we do not take healing, if we don't take kind of like the blessings and the knowledge and the wisdom from other races, other genders, other sexual orientations, if we don't take that knowledge, if we don't take it in and acknowledge that there's groups that are very much marginalized for who they are. A lot of them are within these intersecting identities. A lot of people feel that, like, if I solve one problem here, that would be good. But we have to understand that if we don't solve for the intersectionality that's within a lot of folks, then we're just going to have this discourse when it comes to conversation. And that's what's so hard about making this social and equitable change. It's really solving for that intersectionality within the systemic, within the systems that are existing out there. A lot of people feel that if we solve for one thing, yeah, that's equitable. But no, we have to really look at, not only race equity, but we also have to look at accessibility. We also have to look at sexual orientation, gender identity. We also have to look at all these things. And to be able to have that conversation means that we have to include all those types of folks to inform on the decisions and the programs and the policies that we're making within our own organizations, as well as the institutions that we seek to change.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah.
I can add some of my thoughts. I think one tangential thing we can do is really trying to get the ground truth of what is going on, visualize it, as well as keep a track of what happened to some of those real hate crimes that has been sort of confirmed as a hate crimes by legal forces. Actually, lots of time we saw those news, right? But we don't know what happened afterwards. I do wonder what happened afterwards. If people are not paying price for what they did, I'm not sure, more people will just do more, right? So I do wonder, as a community, we should come together, at least understand what's going on, and also making sure our legal forces are held accountable for what is going on. That's probably the first step. And then the second step is, I think it's also important as a community ourselves, right, come together and then really like support each other for what is going on. I think a lot of times this kind of events that rarely happen. Maybe each individual community is doing their campaigns and doing their work, but we hear about each other, but not really working together. So I would love to see more of this kind of like organic events happening, and we're sharing each other's stories and also supporting each other and really making the force bigger instead of making it smaller. Because if we're already kind of minority group in the US, right? I think we shouldn't dilute further, because otherwise the voice is really, really small compared to a lot of other things that is going on. And then lastly, I also wonder, micro level, I personally felt a lot of times when we actually encounter something, what really matters at that moment, what other people around us did, right? So that's why I felt like we need to obviously develop more allies, but meanwhile, ourselves need to be that kind of allies and for each other. When things happen, do not be afraid of calling it out. Do not be afraid of standing up for each other, because I think that moments of truth is really matters. If no one stands for you or stand up for you, then you really get that trauma, and it's going to take years to heal. So I think that macro level is just a plea to everyone who is listening to today's event.
Yeah, thank you. How about Vincent?
Well, everything everyone said has been so great. You know, I think at our work at Stop API Hate, you know, our broader theory is that we do have to achieve equity by combating systemic racism against all BIPOC people, including Asian Americans, that this can't be won just by battling interpersonal racism against Asian Americans, that the solidarity has to dismantle, you know, a lot of America's roots in white supremacy and patriarchy and other forms of oppression, that we have to prioritize the healing of people who've been impacted, you know, the healing of our communities. And then ultimately we have to strengthen movements, not just organizations, but movements, and movements that empower all of us to, you know, take action around shared values, around shared stories, and also around shared demands. And a lot of those shared demands are to our public institutions. And in that realm, we've already started this work, and in California, there's a lot more to do. But they do relate to making sure that we have education equity that includes ethnic studies, that we have stronger civil rights laws so that all people can live more free from discrimination and bias, so that we can have community safety, and a community safety that really encompasses all the different ways that we experience harm. You know, so I think that, you know, this agenda hopefully will get at a lot of the manifestations of hate, whether that's on public transit or in private businesses or in schools, you know, street harassment, but also the underlying motivations, right? And ultimately, we know that we do have to get at many of the underlying motivations, and that starts, you know, in conversations like this. It continues in conversations that we all have with others, that people who are listening, you know, have with others. And you know, all these things, you know, need to happen together. And it's so exciting to me, and as difficult as the past period has been, I've been so heartened and inspired to see just how many, you know, tens of thousands, millions of Americans and community members, you know, are now really saying enough is enough, and linking arms with others who've been in the struggle for a long time, and, you know, to really demand that, you know, our country can be a diverse democracy that works, where all of us who have been on the margins can begin to have more access to power and to justice.
Yeah, thank you all very much for your insight about how to work together as a community. And it's just many different things in many different aspects. You know, it's about infrastructure, it's about healing, personal care, it's about community building, it's about allyship, it's about education. Just so many things need to be happening. But I know you are working on that. I know many of us are working on that, and many people in the audience are working on that too. So it's I think it will be very, very good for people to really draw the energy from all of you as the seasoned community leaders, so they can continue on with what they do. And we do have 2 questions from the audience. It's, we only have about 7-8 minutes left, so we're going to go through them very quickly. One is about social media. Social media has become a very powerful channel to raise awareness about racial justice and anti-Asian racism. But it can also be very limiting, right? We all know that. A lot of times you tend to stay inside, within your own social groups, right? So how can we share stories, with a broader audience, and how we can really use social media to fight for our cause? Can anyone chime in on that one?
I'll go first, and I'll just say that this is a major public policy problem, and that we've seen online hate and bigotry run rampant on many of these social media platforms. They've led in some cases to genocide in parts of the world, and so I think we have to be really smart about how we hold these institutions accountable to at the very least not creating harm. I think we all know that there's a lot of disinformation that's spread on social media that tries to pit communities against one another. And so we have to try wherever we can to push back against that. And then I think more optimistically, it is a way for us to be connected and for us to know and see what good things are happening too. And so for all the things that have been horrible and painful, we also know that there's so much good in the community, in all communities, right? And maybe if we can lift some of that up as we start the holiday seasons, it would give us all more strength and resolve to keep up this work.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, the next question from the audience is about the workplace. Of course, this is a very, very big issue, and the bias and discrimination at workplace, right? At least a recent study shows that because of bias and stereotyping, Asian Americans are the least likely racial group to be promoted to management and executive position. So, in your opinion, how can we dismantle such bias and stereotyping in the workplace? I know it's a very big question, but if you can shed some light on that, that would be great.
Maybe that's something I can chime in.
Sure.
I think 2 things, in my opinion. One is that representation really matters. And then if you want to really change how this whole thing works, we have to really focusing on first getting some folks in the community to the leadership positions, so they can start changing the dialogue, changing also the model of who a great leader should look like, right? Because I think a lot of this bias also coming from the traditional corporate culture about this kind of assertive, maybe very strong, very alpha type of leaders that sometimes is different from a lot of our culture, right? What we have been taught to grow up with. And the humbleness, the soft-spokenness, the collaborativeness, maybe not being considered as being the leadership material. So I think the first thing to change that dialogue is literally having people who are like that become a leader. So then you can see, actually that kind of people can be a leader. Maybe I was wrong about who can be a leader, right? I think that's the first step. And then the second step is probably at every layer of the workplace, right? You need to somehow infiltrate that sort of thinking. I remember one leader in the community, Wendy, she's working on a very similar cause. And then she was talking about, hey, maybe we should actually start having index for the corporations regarding this matter, and hold, again, the corporate leadership accountable for what they're doing. Because otherwise, again, if you don't have data, you can't really confidently say, right, what is going well, what is not going well. Also, you don't want to accidentally punish the ones that are doing well. They're actually doing inclusive work. They are really trying to help the community. You want to award them. And when the ones that not doing that well, then maybe you want to give them a nudge. So I think the second step is also similar as the earlier, the concrete action item I was advocating for. I do think data is really powerful. And we as a community, probably it's upon our shoulder to sort of focusing on creating those kind of data point, and then also connecting that data point to their action and making them like responsible for the outcome. And I think with both, then maybe we have a hope to start addressing this bias systematically.
Well, if I may too, I would like to add one other thing that can be done at work, right? But organized, right? I think there are things that happen at work that are really similar to the community, right? Like if you don't say anything about what needs to change or what needs to happen, then it doesn't change and it doesn't happen. So organized, right? I mean, we've seen some of that happen in the corporate world right now through ERGs, right? Employee resource groups, and there's conversations happening within ERGs. But I would even take it a step further and say, start looking at the workplace in the way that the labor movement has looked at the workplace, right? Workers deserve an equal voice. And so on things like inclusion and diversity and justice, you can organize around those concepts. I used to be a union organizer as well, working in Mississippi, Washington, DC, and here in the Bay Area. And the one thing that we always taught, the one thing that I always spoke to with our members is, you make the job successful, you make the company successful. And so if you feel that the company is not respecting your labor and your contributions, then you have to stand up and do something about it. So in the workforce, I believe that you have, in a job, if you get organized too, it maybe doesn't have to look like exactly like what the traditional labor union does, but traditional these days isn't necessarily the best selling point for anything. But organize, work together with with your colleagues, with your coworkers, with your fellows, and make changes happen at the workplace.
I know we're short on time, but I want to say that to clarify something, workplace discrimination, bias, harassment, it is against the law. People do not go to jail for it, so it's not treated as part of the criminal justice system, but it is against the law. And in California, the Department of Fair Employment and Housing has a responsibility to hold companies and workplaces accountable for making sure that there is no workplace discrimination, harassment, bias, prejudice, right? Not just in offices, but when we see who has been on the receiving end of a lot of the hate, it includes essential workers, it includes nurses, it includes people who are delivering food, right? And so in all these workplaces, do look a little bit different these days. And so I think there's so many ways that we have to remember when we talk about the different facets of workplace, that it's just so important that across the board throughout San Jose, California, the entire country, that to treat these issues systemically, right, and to hold our in many ways our government accountable to providing these protections.
Yeah,
something really small here, just because I don't want to restate things that Chen said, because I actually absolutely agree. I was going to add one more thing, that there's a lot of subtlety in that kind of prejudice and discrimination, and being from that, again, I'm going to say larger umbrella of Asians. Yes, we are taught to be more respectful, to be more humble, not to demand promotions. It's just not part of our common for us to be as a part of upbringing. But what I do say is that I think it's also important for us to know that when those things happen, it is not something wrong with us. It's really important for us to tell each other that that small subtle incident that happens at work, do not brush it off. Please make it known, because unfortunately, because of this personality of being accommodating, it is a double-edged sword. So we also actually take a lot because of it, and we have to get better at pushing back. So I won't take any more time on that. I just wanted to emphasize how important it is for us to stand up for ourselves, even though it's not part of our natural grain.
Yeah, thank you. I wish we'd continue on with this conversation tonight, but we have to wrap up. But let's hope we'll have a lot more conversation coming. I know we will have those conversations. And I also want to let you know, all the guests, wonderful guests know, you're getting lots of love, in the comments from our audience. So they really enjoy your talk. But, I want to say thank you. So to everyone in the audience, thank you for coming today. And I hope you have enjoyed tonight's conversation and found it very inspiring and energizing. I also want to thank the entire panel, for sharing their insight on a topic that matters a great deal to all of us. And thanks again to the City of San Jose and the Society of Heart's Delight for organizing the panel. Together, we are stronger. That's indeed true. And thank you, and have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.